economists across the board, including today President Trump's former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, arguing strenuously that now is the time for that type of decisive action for the economy, and that we can't wait to provide the resources to make sure that we can open schools, we can get vaccine shots in people's arms, and we can provide that bridging relief to families and small businesses. There's a lot of support. I met with a group of mayors yesterday, bipartisan group of mayors from across the country. You hear from mayors, you hear from governors just crying out that in order to take on these crises, the public health and the pandemic and the economic crisis at the same time, now is the moment for that kind of decisive action. That's the case we'll be making.
And just to be clear, Brian, will President Biden be on the call? And if not, why not, if this is so urgent?
So, like I said, we're doing all outreach. The president has directed the team to do outreach to members of Congress, to business and labor organizations, to mayors and governors, and we're in the process of doing that. I'll be having that conversation on Sunday. You can expect that other members of the administration will be engaging with members of Congress across time as well.
And just very quickly, Brian, if I could, what would a February impeachment trial, how would a February impeachment trial impact getting the COVID relief package passed?
Look, I think that we are facing right now a period of multiple crises. And what we're going to need is to be able to act on multiple fronts. And so that's certainly, we understand, and as Jen has spoken to, we understand that the Senate has a constitutional obligation in this context. But we also have these pressing economic and pandemic priorities as well. So that's why we're engaging. That's why we're focused on making the case, and certainly with the expectation that Congress will heed that call and move forward.
I promised to do a whole briefing after this, so just we'll do econ questions for Brian. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you very much. If you are able to pass this nearly $2 trillion plan, do you envision this being the last round of stimulus, or do you think you may need to do more?
What I can tell you is if we don't act now, we will be in a much worse place, and we will find ourselves needing to do much more to dig out of a much deeper hole. So what I can tell you is the single most important thing economically right now is to take decisive action along the lines of what we've laid out in this rescue plan. And you hear, again, from economists across the board, whether it's the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, and economic experts across the political spectrum as well. When you're at a moment that is as precarious as the one we find ourselves in, the risk of doing too little, the risk of undershooting far outweighs the risk of doing too much. And that's the economic logic, the economic case behind this package. I think you've also heard the president clearly explain that his economic approach is one where rescue and recovery need to come together. And he'll be speaking more about his recovery plans in the coming weeks that are about building back better, an urgent priority to start creating the kinds of good jobs that we know we're going to need coming out of this crisis.
And after the recession, it took nearly a decade to get the country back to full employment under the Obama administration. If you're able to pass this rescue package, how long do you think it will take for every American who wants a job to be able to have one?
Well, I would just point to, just one example of an independent analysis that was done of the American Rescue Plan by Moody's. And what they said, what they found was that if we passed the American Rescue Plan now, we could see 7.5 million jobs created just this year. And we could see a return to full employment a full year ahead of what is projected if we don't. So those are the stakes involved. And without this kind of decisive action, we're going to have a much deeper economic hole. And that's why we are so focused on making the case for a decisive action now.
Justin?
Thanks, Jen and Brian. I wanted to follow on Walker's question a little bit. The President has talked about seeking unity on this bill, but also being clear-eyed when there's policy differences. So I'm wondering if after this call, which is with sort of the bipartisan coalition that you'd need to get this bill passed, if you expect to know whether the White House will pursue legislation, bipartisan legislation, or sort of head towards legislation through reconciliation. And I'm also wondering if you could talk about what sort of red lines will be, the point at which you say, okay, if you're not willing to negotiate about this in the bill, we're going to just start working with Democrats as Speaker Pelosi and others have encouraged you to do.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd say two things to that. The first is, if you look at the elements of the American Rescue Plan, it was designed with a bottom-up focus on what are experts saying is the actual need. What's the actual need to get schools open? What's the actual need to have a national vaccination distribution plan to underwrite the strategy that you heard Dr. Fauci and the president talk about yesterday? And what's the need to support families and businesses during this transition? And the second thing is that as a result of that, I think we're seeing a lot of support. As I said, bipartisan mayors, bipartisan governors, business organizations, Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, economists across the board, saying this is an appropriate response to an unprecedented economic circumstance. So that's the approach that we are taking, and that's the perspective that we are bringing here. And I think that we are heartened to see that kind of support. And that's the conversation that we're going to have with members of Congress, be they Republicans or Democrats, including, looking at where we are, where we've come over the last year and the lessons we've learned, that without decisive action, we know the consequences. And so now is a moment not to undershoot or to wait and see. Now is a moment to act.
I guess my question is, I think a lesson that a lot of President Obama and others have talked about from the ACA fight was continuing to court Republican support beyond a point of it being productive. And so I'm wondering, for you guys, what is the decision point going to be where you might have Republican mayors, but it doesn't look like you have Republican senators right now. At what point do you say this is no longer worth kind of pushing forward?
We're making the case. We are engaging. We're having conversations. We're listening. And we are also focused on the urgency and the need to act. And so, what I can tell you is that's where the president's focus is. That's where the vice president's focus is. That'll continue to be our focus. Is we want to engage and we want to act, and that's going to be what guides us here.
It's going to be the last one, but Brian will come back.
Thank you for doing this, Brian. Back to the point of the objections of some of these Republican senators who have already spoken out. They say they just passed $900 million or so at the end of the year. Most of it isn't even out yet. How do you know, if that money hasn't gotten into the system yet, that you even need to release more at this point? Why move ahead with a $1 trillion plan if the $900 million that's already been approved hasn't even gotten out there?
Sure. Well, first of all, we waited for 6 months or more before Congress acted, and so really a lot of what that $900 billion was doing was filling a hole in the second half of 2020 that desperately needed to be filled, and so this is not an issue of Congress acting too much. It's an issue of not acting enough. And the second is, if you look at the components of the $900 billion, again, we could go line by line, but these are resources that are either already out the door or are addressing economic challenges or public health challenges that were in the rearview mirror. So as we find ourselves today, looking forward, we need a very decisive set of actions if we are actually going to get schools open, if we're actually going to get a vaccination program up and running. And I think that the case that we will make is that today we're not where we need to be. And if we go line by line in the American Rescue Plan, these provisions have been designed based on an assessment of need. And we think they're going to absolutely be necessary. So, I think that looking forward, we're quite confident that this is the prudent assessment of needs.
And I want to clarify two quick things. How many federal employees or federal contractors are making minimum wage right now? Do you guys know?
So I don't have an estimate of that right now.
And then last night you said that there are roughly 8 million people who haven't received their stimulus checks.
Yes.
How do you find them?
So it's a great question. This is principally an issue associated with people who are non-filers, so they're not filing income taxes, in most cases because they don't make enough money to need to file federal income taxes. And so as a result, the way that the IRS and the Treasury Department in the previous administration has focused on getting those checks out has been to work through the tax system. But those are people who are legally entitled to those checks. So we have a number of strategies that we're going to pursue. And that today we'll start with the President's executive order to direct the Department of Treasury to consider a whole range of efforts, including creating an online portal that would allow people to easily identify if they're eligible, to work through counterpart organizations to actually affirmatively do outreach to communities where we know there are significant numbers of these families and these individuals, to let people know that they may be available. Some of this is education outreach as well. And I would just, it's a little connected to what I was saying about small business as well. What the President is directing all of us to do is to really focus on the affirmative steps that we can take, and an affirmative strategy to say it's not enough to just say, well, if folks don't know or if they don't have a network, then they're left out in the cold. We're gonna work both directly in what the federal government can do and with partner organizations to try to make sure that every American who's entitled to a benefit is actually receiving it.
But if there's someone out there right now who hears you saying this and realizes I'm eligible and I haven't gotten it, right now today, is there a way for them to raise their hand and say, send me my check?
Well, starting today, we're going to start a process to make that a lot easier for families, including being able to go online and do that. But that's work that's going to start today.
I totally skipped the AP, so would you mind taking one more?
I just want to.
Didn't mean to.
Thank you. I just have one small question on the mechanics of the EO targeting the food insecure. Does the USDA have the money to distribute these plus-ups that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Or is there going to need to be an appropriations from Congress?
So these are mandatory appropriated programs, so there's no need for additional congressional action. It's a change in regulation on the eligibility for benefits. So these are changes that can be made under existing statute and under existing budgetary authority without any additional action from
The
Congress.
money's there, though, to...
Yeah, it's a mandatory program, so it operates based on the benefits are paid out based on who is eligible.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I'll be back.
Great. Thank you all.
All right, everyone. Happy Friday. I have a couple of things just at the top. Some things you've been